Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today it's finally time for the Orb Odds and Ends. Alright then, I have been dragging my feet on this one for all the usual reasons, these videos being a ton of work and guaranteed to not perform well with the algorithm, blah 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 blah. Clearly my personal frustration with making another overlong Odds and Ends is the worst thing happening in the world right now. But the Orb are yet another band that feel like they need a video breaking down the various side offerings and other loose stuff. I obviously can't go into every project that every member of the Orb has been involved with, or every loose track or remix that could be relevant to a video like this, because I'd be stuck here, like, literally forever. But there are enough loose projects that either directly from the Orb or directly related to the Orb through involvement from Alex Patterson and other regular Orb members that they would need a video like this going into them. So for the benefit of the fans and completionists, here are all the most relevant Orb and Orb-related projects I have things to say about that I haven't talked about yet. To start out with, let's talk about the most glaring omission from my Orb series so far, in a project that many would argue could even qualify as the main Orb album, Pomme Fritz. This is a 6-track, 41-minute mini-album that the Orb released in between U.F.Off and Orbis Terrarum in 1994, still from the days when Chris Weston was on board. Some people consider it a main album, some people consider it an EP, you could even call it a remix album too if you wanted, centered around the title track and then variations on ideas built off the title track in various different ways. I personally don't consider it a main album for that reason, but it is probably the most important project I'll be talking about in this video and the one most integral to the Orb story. Patterson himself even considers it one of his personal favorite projects in the Orb catalog, one for the real fans, and even calling it a clear out for the Orb's fanbase at the time for how controversial it turned out to be, and how it separated out the people who would really become Orb fans for the long haul. It also kind of doubled as a fuck you to their label at the time, as well as to the press who wanted to pigeonhole who they were, as this project probably remains the single most odd and experimental project in the Orb catalog to this day. A lot of cuts that focus on meandering tape manipulations and other strange effects and soundscapes, even a bit of straight-up musique concrète, and without nearly as much preoccupation with having a solid groove or melody or anything like that. It's pretty damn out there, to say the least. One of the most challenging projects the Orb ever have to their name. And Patterson is quite proud to have such a bizarre and nonsensical project to have still managed to chart pretty high at the time. Now, of course, while I do consider this the most important project to check out that I'll be talking about in this video for the sake of getting a more complete picture on what the Orb are all about, and I think it shows a side to them that they haven't really explored again in the same way since, I'm not sure if I'd say it's one of my personal favorite things they've put out. It's a project that I have a lot of respect for, how risky and strange it is, certainly never feeling like a half-baked offering. And I do generally like it, but I almost never actually feel the urge to put it on, aside from reminding myself what the experience is like. There was one moment here that I remembered really disliking when I first heard this thing as a kid, being, "We're pesty to be grill you." Though, to be fair, it wasn't even close to as bad as I remembered coming back to it. It's fine. It's just the album's weirdest moment by far. It's just straight up musique concrète. It's entirely made out of tape manipulations, nothing but samples being sped up and down and looped and echoed, and there's no coherent structure to anything. And some of the moments, especially where the tapes get sped up and lead to a chipmunk effect that starts to become a bit of a turnoff, like the first 20 seconds especially, I'm just like, eh. It's certainly never boring, does explore a lot of different creepy sounds over the course of 7 minutes. It's just not something I'd ever really choose to seek out on its own, I guess. The rest of the project is pretty cool. It's all extremely sparse and meandering, and I do think a lot of the ideas explored here were improved upon on Orbis Terrarum, but it still clearly retains that specific brand of strangeness that's easily recognizable as the Orb, especially with that one sample that keeps reappearing on several different tracks that says like, "Oh, you've just undergone electroshock therapy. All those childhood traumas magically wiped away, along with most of your personality." Yeah, that's on brand a sample as you can get. It will probably come to the surprise of absolutely no one that I believe the opener and title track to be easily the biggest highlight of the release. All the layers of plucky guitar loops, vibraphone samples, lightly marching electronic percussion, screechy echoing synth licks, and other various sounds that come and go create this really alluring sense of wide open space. Had it been on Orbis Terrarum, it would have been one of the better tracks on there for sure. The project's worth checking out as a whole just for that one track, if absolutely nothing else. More Gills, Less Fish Cakes is pretty fun, a combination of elements of the title track and the following We're Past You to Begrill You, and all its amorphous and crazy tape manipulations going over occasional light and spacey drum beats, also some weird sidetracks into sci-fi bleeping effects. It's a pretty strange trip, but has just enough structure and energy to still keep me engaged the whole time. I really like that one. I do also generally like the focus on those lighter techno-flavored beats on Banger and Chips. And the wailing melodic paths that carry through most of Alles is Shown. Gee, I wonder if Thomas Feldman was involved in that one. And the project does end in a 2-minute carnival organ outro called His Immortal Logness, which I'm not crazy about. But yeah, the rest is all cool for what it is. And it's just that aside from the first track, I wouldn't say I love any of it. It's nice for a bit of like off-the-wall fun, but my attention tends to trail off a little bit. Like I said, even if it's not as experimental, I do prefer the way these sounds were worked into much more expansive and atmospheric compositions on Orbis Terrarum. Pomme Fritz is still a cool project and an experience unlike anything else, either in the Orb Zone catalog or really anywhere else. If this were one of your favorite Orb projects, I would get it, and I also get why Patterson is so proud of it. I myself just don't have any especially strong feelings attached to it, hence getting relegated to this video. I love the first track, I really like the second, and the rest is fun enough where I could probably let the project as a whole get away with a 7.3 out of 10. It is a good project and worth at least one listen for the sake of curiosity. I just kinda wish I felt more strongly about it than I do. Now, while we're on the topic of albums made out of one central original track that never appears elsewhere in a collection of various remixes of said track, from there I'm gonna skip all the way ahead to 2011 and talk about Battersea. I typically don't like talking about remix albums in general. A lot of them would just boil down to a collection of, yeah, that sure sounds like X artist's take on Y song, and they're not as fun to talk about. They always just feel like supplementary additions to more interesting original works, and it's exceedingly rare for me to want to listen to a remix album more than once, if at all. I technically once did a video on like a remix EP for these guys' Chill Out World album, but only because Pedersen himself told the guy who manages the Orb's Twitter to send me a free copy of it as thanks for my review of Chill Out World, and I was totally starstruck. If that hadn't happened, I wouldn't have even thought to check it out at all. But Battersea is more of a special case for me when it comes to remix albums, because it doesn't feel like a supplementary add-on to something else. When I was a kid, I first saw the pre-order for this thing announced on iTunes, and I thought it was their next proper album, a direct follow-up to Metallic Spheres. And it technically wasn't that. It's the soundtrack to a 17-minute experimental short film called Battersea Bunches, and a collection of remixes of said soundtrack, all given their own original titles. But the project always did feel more like its own thing that could stand on its own, and I honestly kind of hold it in a similar camp to Pomme Fritz in that way. Pomme Fritz has more importance to the overall story of the Orb and is more of an interesting outlier in their sound. Certainly it's a lot more famous and more widely covered, but weirdly enough I've felt the urge to actually come back to this one a lot more often. It's the only remix album I own a physical copy of. Admittedly by pure chance, since I'd ordered a different Orb album and got sent this by accident, but I already knew I liked the album and wasn't about to complain that I now had it in my collection. I don't know if I'd say it's amazing or anything, but it's the only remix album I can even think of that I've ever had in regular listening rotation at any point in my life. And coming back to it, yeah, it still holds up. And the central soundtrack cut isn't even the best part of the experience. I mean, it is very nice, a meandering 17-minute run through various different sounds, from creaky guitars to piano loops to TV announcers to marching percussion tracks that sounded pulled out of some Orbis Terrarum era cuts, to particularly a lo-fi recording of some guy humming to himself. The sounds aren't really connected to each other, but they do all sound cool and add up to the same kind of sparse and experimental soundscapes that Pomme Fritz explored, I guess. At least if they'd added in some tape manipulations, it would have fit right at home on that track listing, I think. Of course, the actual remixes on this album aren't nearly as out there, but they do fit together surprisingly well, and each provide their own unique twist on the sounds and motifs the opener explores. Heck, the majority of the remixes on here are just the usual people you'd find collaborating behind the scenes on a regular Orb album. And as such, none of it ever strays too far from sounding like the Orb. You got HFB, which itself is already just an Orb side project and a collab between Patterson and Dom Beacon. More on that later in this video. It's weird. But they contribute a remix entitled To Battersea with Bunches, which is easily my favorite cut in the bunch, and honestly stands toe-to-toe with a lot of my favorite Orb tracks overall. Taking that one piano loop from the soundtrack cut and fleshing it out into a fully realized track that sounds like it's being performed by a full band, much stronger drumming and bass lines, even a whole bunch of really dramatic string washes. It's got such an intense and dark flavor to it that I don't get out of any other Orb track, and I immediately fell in love with it from the first time I heard a snippet of it on iTunes as a kid. And while that cut is still pretty handily my favorite, all the other ones on here are really solid too. Gowdy delivers a pretty deep and grooving dub mix called Meandering Through the Emerald Turf that even borders on old school UK dubstep with all the bass wubs that get thrown in around the edges. That's a banger that still fits perfectly with the usual Orb sound. And David Harrow's mix called Brixton Hundreds is just straight up UK dubstep, with the wobbling filtered bass and plodding halftime beats you'd expect out of that genre. I think this may have technically been the first dubstep track I had ever heard, although I absolutely did not realize it at the time, and I honestly forgot there was such a cut on this thing. Also, my perception of what dubstep meant subsequently got fairly warped shortly after this as I discovered a certain other popular EDM guy, but never mind that. Nocturnal Sunshine's remix called Latchmere Allotments takes a bit more of a UK garage direction with its more up-tempo beat work and even some really low-key female vocalists humming in added for good measure. That might actually be Nocturnal Sunshine herself, but I don't know for sure. Being's remix called Red House Brown Dog has more of an IDM kind of flavor with its skittering beats and rubbery bass lines. And the Autolump remix called Beyond the Legend of the Battersea Asparagus Triangle goes for more of a driving atmospheric techno approach, one of the more epic sounding cuts in the bunch. Side note, I considered including Autolump in this odds and ends since I heard Patterson was part of that band at one point, and it is headed by frequent Orb collaborator Phil Lagondiak, though I couldn't find a citation that confirms which projects Patterson actually contributed to or what his role in the band might have been. Also, their stuff is near impossible to find aside from one EP that didn't seem that interesting, so I just opted to skip over them entirely. But, getting back on topic, the album ends with Thomas Fellman's remix, Battersea Bunny's Munching Orbular Marrow Mix. And this is a pretty nice cut to finish with, one of the more tight and grooving takes on Fellman's usual dub techno formulas with particular focus put on that sample of the guy humming, which after you hear this mix will start to haunt your dreams. And yeah, that's everything See Battersea has to offer. Well, it also has a DVD that has the above-mentioned experimental film as well as 3 extra music videos for some of the other remixes. I didn't actually bother to watch it, but yeah. Okay, since I have the DVD, I briefly skimmed through these videos. They sure are videos. Anyway, all around, See Battersea is a really fun album. I don't know if I can bring myself to say it's an absolutely essential addition to the Orb pantheon or among the absolute best the band has to offer. I don't know if it quite crosses over into great territory, but I've always had a personal soft spot for it. I've kept it around this whole time and periodically come back to it, mostly for To Battersea with Bunches, but the rest is really good and stuck out as memorable to me too. And again, that's extremely rare for a remix album to elicit that kind of reaction out of me, especially as a complete whole. It's probably my favorite remix album of all time, which isn't actually saying much, but still. It may be a side curiosity at the end of the day, and I can't go as far as to say I think it would make sense as a main album, but it's a side curiosity that does manage to stand on its own and I have spent a lot of time with over the years. I can pretty safely recommend it to any longtime fans of the band and give it a very strong 7.7 out of 10. Now, I guess while I'm on the topic of remixes, the Orb have a crap ton of remixes collected over lots of various projects and even other full remix albums. As I said, I don't really tend to find remix albums interesting to talk about, so I'm mostly skipping over those. Like, they have 3 different remix compilations in a series called Auntie Aubrey's Excursions Beyond the Call of Duty, which are all over 2 hours each, and I can't be bothered to sit through all of that. In the recent 3rd volume from the end of 2020, I did spot one really unfortunate track title, but never mind that. I'll talk about one remix album in particular since I'd seen a couple of people specifically request that I talk about it. Aubrey mixes the Ultraworld Excursions. Aubrey mixes. I only just got the pun with that title while writing this segment. Because I'm American, I've seen that title several times at the top of their Discogs page and just figured, oh, it's named after someone named Aubrey. I don't get the reference to. Possibly fictional, but no, you say it with a British accent. Aubrey mixes. Remixes, you Anyway, this project was released almost concurrently with Adventures Beyond the Ultraworld in 1991, apparently available to purchase for 1 day before being taken off store shelves and entirely consisting of remixes of tracks from that album, of course. Also, you know how I said that Battersea was the only remix album I own a CD of? Technically, that's a lie, though only partially, since 5 of the 7 remixes were included on the bonus disc with the 2006 deluxe CD reissue of Adventures Beyond the Ultraworld here. I've seen a number of people say they prefer these versions of the tracks over the ones that made the album proper, so I thought, what the hell, I'll just try this one and see how it goes. And, I guess it's fine. I had the same reaction to this that I do to pretty much all remix albums. It's a perfectly fine set of supplementary alternate versions of the original album versions that I'm almost certainly not going to come back to. It does have a pretty solid continuous mix, and a lot of these cuts do feel like they have a bit more detail and texture than the album versions, which are more stripped back. Not to mention these mixes are a bit more dance-heavy on average. But honestly, for the most part, a lot of this stuff isn't different enough from the originals to really stick out to me. Steve Hillage turns Backside of the Moon into Supernova the End of the Universe, with a few extra water sound effects and an extra bass line in the last 2 minutes. Youth mashes up Spanish Castles in Space with Blue Room and then adds a bunch of sitars and extra effects, including some weird screaming noise every few beats in the extended mix. Ready Made moved Outlines into a different key and gave it a Mr. Fingers Can You Feel It style bass line. Pal Joey took Little Fluffy Clouds and turned it into a deep house leaning cut, which is at least something different, though it's still nowhere near as fun as the original. There's a remix of A Huge Ever-Growing Pulsating Brain that I think was on the original single in 1989 that is in a different key and has a slightly stronger dance beat. I don't know what you want me to say about this stuff. Ironically, the only one that really stuck out to me was Thrash's January Mix 3 remix of Perpetual Dawn, the only one that isn't on the CD I own. I thought taking out those iconic lead guitars and letting all the various sampled sound effects echo out in a much bigger and emptier sounding ambient subspace was actually a pretty interesting idea and a neat spin on an old classic. The CD I have replaces this mix with Perpetual Dawn Ultra Bass 2, a remix by Andrew Weatherall, which is admittedly also pretty solid, much more faithful to the original mix but amped up, has thicker bass and beats as the title implies, and rebuilt out of a few different ingredients. Not as original a take, but still pretty fun in its own right. But still, I can't imagine I'm actually going to come back to any of this. The main reason I've continued to keep around Battersea is the fact that it's technically all original material you can't get elsewhere, but even if it wasn't, every remix feels like it brings its own unique spin and separate appeal to the original composition that none of the others do, while still all feeling like it adds up to a cohesive work. Like I said, I can't really think of any other full remix album that got that perfect balance right. The Aubrey mixes, I mean, while it's just as perfect to zone out to as the main album is based on, and I guess I can see why some people might prefer these mixes having a bit more detail and texture than the album versions, and for how well the full experience flows, for me it just kind of feels redundant and makes me want to go back to the originals instead. If you told me that this was a live album, I might have found this more interesting. I mean, it's probably too mellow to work super well in that context, but it would have been pretty out of the box if it had been a live performance. But it's not a live album, it's a remix album, and in that context it delivered more or less what I expected. I don't know what to tell you. This is kind of why I don't really like talking about remixes and remix projects in general. I'm sure I'm gonna get a bunch of ticked off folder fans for my take on this one, but hey, people asked me to talk about it, and I did. I'm gonna skip out on the rating for this one. Right, I don't know about you, but I'm itching to talk about some original material again, so how about we talk about some EPs? If you were curious about what their very first material was, even before Huge Ever Growing Pulsating Brain, their first release under the name was the Kiss EP. Well, there was also a track called Trippin' on Sunshine before that on some random various artists comp called Eternity Project 1. That's a really basic acid house cut that isn't much to write home about, like a worse and scrappier version of the KLF's early singles like What Time Is Love. But anyway, the Kiss EP is the earliest actual release I know of credited to the Orb, consisting of 2 original tracks called Kiss Your Love and The Roof Is on Fire, and 2 remixes of the former, and they're also not much to write home about. Maybe even less so than Trippin' on Sunshine. Like, Kiss Your Love is basically just the same loop of clattering samples that doesn't change at all throughout its running time. There's just nothing to it at all. The Roof Is on Fire is better. It's kind of like a rough and super basic prototype of what would eventually become trance, with a few more samples and a bit more progression over time. They exist. They're really nothing you need to go out of your way for. Another EP I can probably note is Daleth of Elphame from 2002. 3 tracks on here, but one of them is Cool Harbor, which would eventually make the cut for Okie Dokie It's the Orb on Compact. But the other 2 cuts are quite nice. I Am the Red Worm is a nice little collection of plinky little synth arpeggios and creepy atmosphere with the usual cheesy sci-fi TV samples. Great title too. Outer Space sounds pretty similar, has a bit more energy and some thicker tech house beats going through most of it. Might even be a little better in its marginally more cinematic mix of synth pads. Not really sure why it got forgotten, maybe because of the more generic title, like, wow, Outer Space, have the Orb ever made a song about outer space before? But yeah, this stuff is all good and worth looking into. Both those tracks are nice. The next EP I found worthy enough of note to mention here was one they did as a collab with Meatbeat Manifesto of all people, called Battersea Shield in 2004. Just 3 tracks, 2 of which are direct collaborations between Alex Patterson, Jack Dangers, and Lynn Farmer, called Matron and 1855 BC, and one of which is just the Orb solo and is Patterson with Phil Agondiak, called Insane. The first of those 3, Matron, wasn't actually new. It was originally released on Meatbeat Manifesto's 2002 album Are You OK? And it was originally called Horn of Jericho, with Patterson credited as a guest feature. Way back when I marathoned MBM's catalog for my review of Impossible Star, I heard this track and it just kind of blended in with everything else on that album. I absolutely never would have guessed Dr. Alex had been involved if you hadn't told me. It just sounds like a Meatbeat Manifesto solo track. But, I mean, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I like Meatbeat Manifesto's style. You still get a fun romp through lots of gritty, banging beats and creepy sound effects as one would typically expect out of them, and plenty of interesting ideas to occupy 7 minutes. Now, the second cut they did together, 1855 BC, does feel a lot more of like a one-to-one combination of their separate styles, combining the gritty, off-the-wall experimentalism and crazy sound design of MBM with the long-form ambient dub approaches that the Orb are known for, even featuring several reprises of samples that I've heard them use in tracks like Outlands and Montandor, including that one sample of Lee Scratch Perry's Blackboard Jungle. And if there is any reason to check out this EP at all, it is this track. It is 18 minutes and 55 seconds of complete batshit insanity, and is an absolute ton of fun. It feels like something new is going on every 10 seconds and is pretty much the best possible result that could have come out of combining the styles of the Orb and Meatbeat Manifesto. A part of me definitely wishes it had been attached to a more substantial release that isn't just like a promo hidden in a random corner of the internet now. But yeah, it absolutely makes the EP worth the price of admission on its own. Now, the last cut, Insane, technically didn't have anything to do with Meatbeat Manifesto at all, though honestly you could have fooled me into thinking otherwise. Insane certainly lives up to its title in all its more frantic and fast-paced banging techno beats and random samples blasting in at various intervals. Sounds like the Orb trying to emulate the style of MBM and doesn't really stick to their usual style as much as you'd think. Though the sample at the very end I recognize from when they used it at the end of A Beautiful Day from The Dream. But whatever. This EP is absolutely just a one-off novelty and a curiosity, and as such I won't be giving it a rating either. I don't think it's anything I see myself coming back to much in the future, but if the combination of these 2 names sounded like it would be fun to you, then it will be. In the MBM catalog, it's not as much of a novelty, but in the Orbs catalog, it very much sticks out as sounding unlike anything else they've ever done, so it's probably worth a shot. And for the last EP I'll mention here, I'm going to skip over to 2016 and talk about their Alpine EP. This was just a collection of 3 completely original tracks they put out in between Moonbuilding and Chill Out World that never appear anywhere else. called Alpine Morning, Alpine Evening, and Alpine Dawn. And yeah, it definitely sounds like something in between Mood Building and Chill Out World. It's extremely Thomas Feldman. It's carrying all the usual blocky stiffness you'd expect out of that guy's style, but hey, it's still pretty solid for what it is and captures some of the appeal of both the albums that surrounded it. Alpine Morning and Dawn are pretty nice ambient adjacent excursions. They're samples of clanging bells like those you'd hear attached to sheep, and even heavily modulated samples of yodeling, because Alpine, I guess. Between those two, I prefer Alpine Dawn. It's a lot more ambient-centric like this stuff on Chill Out World and carries just as much of a pretty and uplifting atmosphere as most of the material on there. And Alpine Evening is the easy highlight of the entire thing. It's way more of a thumping techno banger, and despite carrying over a lot of the naturalistic and marginally folksy atmosphere of the other two cuts, it manages to go way harder than it had any right to. It's a ton of fun. Alpine Morning kind of feels like a compromise between the two extremes and doesn't quite hit on the heights of either, but it's still nice too. Overall, while this EP is not a must-listen by any stretch, it is a quite solid EP that even feels complete and cohesive and standing on its own enough for me to give an actual score. I'll give it a 7.3 out of 10. Next, how about we talk about some compilations? The Orb have 2 B-side compilations and a couple of greatest hits compilations. Before I get into the B-side comps, I'll very quickly shout out their comp U.F.Off, The Best of the Orb, purely because it has this one original single called Mickey Mars that I think is worth looking into. It's got this catchy loop of this Middle Eastern chanting or something like that, and it makes a pretty solid banger. There's a radio edit and an extended Red X mix on that comp if you want to look into that. The comp itself is also a double continuous mix, which is kind of neat, but that's all I have to say on that. Anyway, as I mentioned, the Orb have 2 B-side compilations called Orbsessions that feature a decent amount of rare unreleased material that you can't get elsewhere, so I'll go into those in more detail. Technically, Baghdad Batteries is the 3rd volume of the same series, but like I said in my review of it, I don't think it quite lives up to that billing and feels like something completely separate. But yeah, anyway, Orbsessions Volume 1. It's okay. Never really been huge on Orbsessions. It didn't really care for it when I first heard it several years ago, sometime in college, and coming back to it years later, my thoughts aren't that fundamentally different. By far the best cut in the bunch was the opener, Mummy Don't, which was clearly a leftover from the time Jimmy Cauty was still part of the band, from how much it takes cues from the KLF's Chill Out. Several chunks of this track sound just like the track 3 AM Somewhere Out of Beaumont, but it also feels like an even further expansion on what that track brought to the table, with even more varied vocal samples, more present synth arpeggios that run through much of the track, a few stronger beats as well. It's really freaking good, and a neat insight into Patterson's involvement on the Chill Out album. One little problem though, this cut got taken off the album, presumably due to legal reasons and band members suing each other again, and is no longer available for streaming. The version on streaming replaces it with another forgettable cut called Angel 3 Dub, and unfortunately the rest of the project isn't nearly as enjoyable as that one cut was. The only other one that comes close is Youngle, another 10-plus minute cut that apparently was gonna be on Cydonia, and I believe was on the Napster leaked draft version, but didn't make the final cut. You can hear elements of it creeping into tracks like A Mile Long Lump of Lard and Thursday's Keeper. It's a fast-paced experimental drum and bass banger that has tons of interesting diversions into various sound effects and instrumentation. It's a lot of fun, but there is one little problem with that track as well, and it's the fact that this track's hook of a repetitive vocal sample of some guy's pitched up voice making weird noises got really grating. When I first heard this comp, that hook was enough to kill my enjoyment of the track entirely, especially for how much it's focused on for over nearly 10 minutes. And while it admittedly is not as bad as I remember, and I can get behind everything else the track explores and all its crazy meanderings, it's still enough of an irritation to leave me thinking, maybe it's for the best this didn't make the final cut for Cydonia. It's a very solid track, again a lot better than I remembered, but it had the potential to be great and didn't quite get there for me. Anyway, those 2 tracks are really the only cuts on this thing really worth going out of your way for. And there's 2 more which are active turnoffs for me. The comp's ending cut, Pluto Calling Twinkle, reprises that pitched up Twinkle Twinkle Little Star sample from Jimmy Cauty's Space album, aka my least favorite part of that entire project. And while the rest of it is just a meandering blob of ambient noise and robotic voices, it's still just eh. But that's nothing compared to Sail, which, oh dear God, is this what Once More sounds like to the people who hate Cydonia? This is a ridiculously cheesy pop cut with light and breezy acoustic guitars, a basic C major chord progression that approaches being the 4 chords of pop, and a bunch of acid synth progressions plastered on top that do not fit at all. And all the cheery female vocals and plastic sounding harmonies are just so sickeningly sweet and radio friendly. Like, the Orb may have no shortage of cheesy vocal pop cuts in their catalog, and I tend to defend those more often than not, but this one really turned me off because the final sound was so sterile and bland. This stinks of, like, adult contemporary music. It's like the kind of thing you'd hear Bryan Adams singing over. And it makes no goddamn sense coming out of the Orb, whose vocal tracks are usually either a lot sillier and lean into that, or focus more on their atmospheric side. This just sounds like mid-2000s Wine Mom music or something. I mean, it worked for some people. Some people said that track is really good, but I didn't really care for it. The rest of the comp wasn't nearly that much of a turnoff, but it's just kind of dull. A lot of it is just kind of meandering jam sessions that have the same general vibe as the material from Bicycles and Tricycles, but without any hooks. I guess Son of sounds like From a Distance with its overblown kick drums and buzzing bass, and 73.5 with Martin Patterson is a decent enough little synth doodle, and there's some tribal influences explored on cuts like Something Like, but I'm not going to remember any of these exist longer term. I think Orbsessions is really only going to be worth it for the diehard fans, and none of it truly reads to me as essential listening, unfortunately. Though it did probably help me appreciate Bicycles and Tricycles more for what it was and started making me feel like I might have been too harsh on it when I did my video on it. At least that album's a heck of a lot more memorable than this one. I'm feeling a 5.5 out of 10 on this. Now, as for Orbsessions Volume 2 from 2007, another collection of various loose tracks from various different places, mostly unreleased, I distinctly remember trying to listen to this one around the same time as the first volume and getting bored to the point of not even being able to make it through the entire thing. And, well, I made it through this time. Though I don't even really have much to say from an individual track perspective here. I guess I did have more to say about individual tracks than I thought I did. Well, one thing I need to point out is that the version I heard was from an old download, and the version that's currently up on iTunes and streaming services appear to have different track listings. They got the same names in the same order, but the tracks themselves are completely scrambled around and have different lengths. For example, I saw the track originally titled It's a Small World, which used to run on for over 13 minutes, is now called Shem Version on the streaming version, which is very confusing, though that track literally starts with a sample that says It's a Small World, so I think the version I had with the CD track lengths is the version it was originally supposed to be and what I'll be referring to. Not that it actually matters much, I could barely tell most of these tracks apart from each other to begin with. Yeah, this was a rough one to get through. It doesn't have any outright clunkers or moments that made me cringe like Volume 1 did, but it does run together way more. You're just getting lots and lots of oily and stiff dub grooves that all have just different enough texture to justify having different song titles. All fairly dark and experimental with very little in the way of coherent melody or any kind of specific hook which might allow a track to stick in your head. If I didn't know any better, I would have thought the entire thing was just all done in one single jam session and the results were uploaded as is. Though it clearly wasn't. I know I've seen Shem appear on some other release elsewhere, and Jam on Your Honey was on one of the Napster leaked versions of Cydonia. This is still an archive compilation. I guess it is mostly the first half of this project that runs together in such a mush. Like, once you get to the giant bolster, these tracks do stand on their own a bit more. Now, I wouldn't say they pick up significantly either. Like, really the only track on here that I see myself ever wanting to come back to was Jam on Your Honey. Easily the best cut in the bunch, with its much lighter blends of synth arpeggios and energetic horn samples. It's so much brighter and sunnier than anything else on this comp, and is a total breath of fresh air. I still wouldn't mark it as among my favorite Orb tracks ever or anything, but it would probably at least be one of the better tracks on Cydonia had it made the cut. It's about on par with something like, I don't know, Hamlet of Kings. It's a solid track. There are other cuts I think are decent. The Giant Bolster in particular was just a bunch of overblown lo-fi orchestral and horn recordings from like the 50s, which feels like a lengthy interlude, but at least it felt like its own thing. I guess I liked Baalbek, which was basically a bunch of random spacey sounds and elements thrown on top of the beat from Into the Fourth Dimension. It does eventually grow a bit stale, but repurposing one of their tightest pre-existing grooves in such a way was not an uninteresting idea. And it's mainly the first half of the comp that bugs me. It's much more tedious and samey than the second half. Cuts like DADOES, Ralph's Cupboard, Shem, and Shem Version, they technically don't sound like each other, but I could not describe to you how. They just totally blend together for me, and I cannot blame younger me for having tapped out and given up completely by the halfway mark. It's all so sludgy and tedious and It's like the least interesting and most unpleasant parts of Orbis Terrarum, Oblivion, and Cydonia mushed together in a nondescript slurry, like Slug Dub without the slugs or the other stuff that actually made that track kind of fun. I guess the 11-minute spacey trip of 2026 is decent enough, has some marginally epic-ish dystopian sounds and some steel drums, and I have a feeling its crushing experimental double unpleasantness will probably make for a fitting soundtrack to whatever hellworld we'll be living in 4 years from now. And I guess the 13-minute It's a Small World had among the more striking grooves in the bunch, slight bit more energy than the average from here, and at least a few fuzzy trumpet solos, which were a welcome touch. But even there, I'm like grasping at straws here. I mean, I would totally get it if this did resonate more with other people who are more interested in seeing the orb in this most untethered experimental form. Like, some people mark Slug Dub as the best part of Orbis Terrarum, and if 75 minutes of those kind of grooves with less flair and definition still sounds like it'd be your thing, then by all means try it. These mixes aren't less well produced or less textured than the usual from the orb, they're just less memorable. But, I mean, I can still obviously tell why all of this hit the cutting room floor. Just as the first volume helped me appreciate bicycles and tricycles, this one helped me appreciate Baghdad batteries. Like, at least those tracks all have more coherent melodies, I can remember what each cut sounds like, and there was a clear driving vision behind all of it. This one completely disappears from my head as soon as it's done. It was a less irritating listen than Volume 1, but I probably got the same amount of enjoyment, and I will also give it a 5.5 out of 10. Anyways, I think that'll be it in terms of compilations, so next it's time to move on to side projects, Orb-related albums that aren't released under the Orb name. And I think a good place to start there would be the self-titled release from FFWD in 1994. This is a full collaboration album between the Orb and Robert Fripp, FFWD standing for Fripp, Fellman, Weston, and Dr. Alex Patterson. I was really excited to check this one out, had known about it for years, ever since someone mentioned the final track on Cydonia, Terminus, apparently sampled material from this album. And I just never got around to checking it out in full before now. Side note, it does turn out that Terminus pretty significantly transformed the source material. Like, just adding a beat and a whole bunch of extra samples gave it a totally different feel from the stuff that's on this album. But yeah, FFWD admittedly does not give me nearly as much to say about it as I hoped. It's a surprisingly minimalistic ambient project that doesn't have the same sense of expanse or texture detail that I thought it would given the people involved. But it is still quite solid for what it is. A lot of this album is taken up by meandering and formless blends of light synth pads. They are all quite emotive for what they are, but a lot of my descriptions of tracks like Lucky Saddle or Meteor Storm or Can of Bliss would be functionally the same. There are a few cuts that focus on different sounds from that core mix of synth pads. Probably my favorite cut in the bunch was the 11-minute Buckwheat and Grits. That one's really amplified by its psychedelic guitar work that isn't too far away from what Fripp did with Brian Eno on their Evening Star album. And my second favorite cut is probably the closer, Suis wie eine Nuss. That has this really deep and cinematic feel to it that reminds me of Vangelis a little bit, and was a nice big emotional moment to close things out. Colossus sticks out like a sore thumb since it has actual percussion, and a fairly jangly and exotic blend at that. Got like some mix of African and Indian elements in there, I guess. And Klong Test has a cool mix of xylophone-like progressions that sound pretty cool. That's about all I got, though obviously don't take my lack of things to say about this project to mean I didn't like it or finding it to be anything special. Like, the tranquil and minimalistic atmosphere does set it apart from any actual Orb albums. Makes sense not being under that name. It kind of lands more into Eno-like territory. It has its own separate appeal. Certainly there was no sacrifice on the emotionality side of things, and I could see this resonating more with certain people than even some main Orb albums. I don't know if I'm going to be keeping it around longer term, but any ambient fans will find it worth looking into for sure, and I can give it a strong 7.3 out of 10. Okay, so the next Orb side project to note would be Transit Kings. This was a collab between a bunch of Orb members and usual collaborators like Patterson, Guy Pratt, and Dom Beacon, but most notably, Jimmy Cauty. The only other time he and Patterson ever collaborated on anything together after 1991. Cauty dropped out of the band almost immediately after it formed, from what I can tell, but he was involved enough behind the scenes to have significant writing credits on most of their only album year from 2006, Living in a Giant Candle, Winking at God. The band never released anything else outside of maybe 2 or 3 loose cuts that are B-sides, 2 singles attached to this album. I think it's safe to say that this one album is going to be the only major thing in note we'll be hearing under this name, but anyway, this album was freaking great. And it's surprisingly not very Orb-like. I mean, a lot of the same appeal is still intact, still got the quirky vocal samples, goofy sense of humor, some of the expansive atmosphere, but despite a few similar ingredients, I don't think I would have easily guessed this was an Orb side project if I didn't already know. The final effect feels more like a more chill twist on the sounds of, like, turn-of-the-century big beat outfits, like Fluke and the Crystal Method. Maybe even BT circa Movement and Still Life, or Robert Miles circa 23am. Way cleaner sounding and more well-polished, and with not nearly as much focus on the usual dub elements. My mind even kind of drifted over to comparatively more recent bands, like Flight Facilities in a few moments, if those guys decided to ditch vocal pop, go experimental, and completely deconstruct all their influences from the ground up. It's still primarily a down-tempo project above all else, but it's way punchier and more crisp sounding than I was expecting to hear, and I had a ton of fun with it. I can even see myself hanging onto it beyond this video. It is really freaking good. Every track on here is good, but highlights include the opener, the west end of a duck going east with all its jazzier textures and sharp bleeping melodies, Concourse with its very pretty and expansive 90s pop sound design, going next to some choir samples, and a hook taken from J Dilla's Lightworks. The acid hip-hop tinges of Oh Shit, which progressively get more and more intense as you go on, layering some pretty kick-ass guitar solos in there. The clattering almost sound effect romp of Japanese cars that feels like a rhythmic recreation of a traffic jam, complete with funk guitar, super intense synth bass, and trumpets layered on top. The 8-minute journey of Free Free and its enjoyably cheesy gospel singer hook. The deep piano-driven excursions of blues tracks and Baby Don't. The latter of which has a bunch of these vaguely Latin-flavored trumpet solos, and the former just has a lot of freaking nice vibraphones. And it finishes with the emotive and cinematic The Last Lighthouse Keeper, which liberally samples such a lighthouse keeper being interviewed, sharing interesting stories of his life doing that job, and name-dropping the album title. Surprisingly more heartfelt way to go out than it might seem on the surface. And I skipped over it, but my favorite moment out of all of these was definitely Boom Bombay. It had way more up-tempo focus that most brought those Crystal Method comparisons to mind. Way more intense breakbeat formulas going next to a whole bunch of these cool expansive synth pads, funk guitar licks, sampled string washes, and catchy wordless vocal hooks. Freaking blew my mind when I first heard it. The album is stronger in its first half than its second, but goddamn, all of it is so good in such a way that totally stands on its own outside the legacy of the Orb. Has to be my favorite of all of their side projects. Absolutely worth checking out. I can give it a strong 8.3 out of 10. The next side project I have to talk about is High Frequency Bandwidth, a collab between Patterson and Dom Beacon, who have released their debut album here, Hellfire and Brimstone, in 2010. Alongside a couple of remix albums and soundtrack albums afterwards, which I did not check out. I was obviously interested in this album thanks to HFB's appearances on the Battersea album, as I mentioned before. Like I said, my favorite cut on that album was their remix to Battersea with Bunches, but after hearing an entire original album from this outfit, okay, I'm not really sure what I expected, but a straightforward commercial hip-hop project was not it. Like, imagine the more polished style explored by the Transit Kings, translated over to a more commercial-sounding early 2000s rap album. That's what Hellfire and Brimstone is. It's not like crunk or anything like that, but it's easily the most mainstream-friendly Orb-related project I've ever heard, and I'm not fully sure how I feel about that. Now, surprisingly enough, it is not cringe, and it had the potential to be, especially given the small handful of tracks where Patterson contributes his own sort of rapping while covered in gratuitous vocal effects and mixed more as a background element. Patterson rapping alongside a large chorus of female singers going soul brother, soul sister music on the track High Five Brother was probably the cringiest part, but even that wasn't nearly as bad as it sounds on paper. Patterson's voice was not nearly as out of place as you might expect it to be. There is something to be said for that. Like, none of this stuff was an active turnoff. But it was also not nearly as good as the Transit Kings album. Like, aesthetically it's very similar, but it's slightly less well textured and with a lot more DJ scratching. It feels more dated and less charming. It's kind of like if BT decided he wanted to make a whole album that sounded like Love on Height Street. Like, sure, I guess? This is just weird and off-brand. Like, while Transit Kings had enough of appeal in common with the Orbscore material that I might have possibly had a chance of figuring out it was an Orbside project, I absolutely never would have been able to figure that out with HFB. There's a few cuts here that sound kinda like some moments on No Sounds Are Out of Bounds. Hitchcock's First Bugle has some trumpet solos that resemble the ones that would go on to show up on Ununited States. There's a few tracks that have a few more random Orb-style vocal snippets. But for the most part, we are so far removed from the Orb's core style that it's almost kind of jarring. You couldn't even take their track Aftermath from Bicycles and Tricycles and get it to fit on here. That track's still not well polished enough to work in this context, and Fellman's blockier production style would have stuck out like a sore thumb. And all of this adds up to an album, I guess. Most of it just gave me the reaction of, okay, that was a thing. All the various rappers and vocalists do their job well enough to never be distracting, but none of them really go above and beyond. The production is really well balanced and sounds great. It's punchy, it's bright, but something just seems missing that I can't really put my finger on. The best moments for me were some of the instrumental cuts in the back half. The stretch of Harmonic 5 Beatless, Hitchcock's First Bugle, and Hitchcock's First Blunder. That had that nice dramatic and bombastic soundscapey quality that I liked out of that Battersea remix. Same with the movie soundtrack ready closer, Huge Fiery Ball. Yes, every track title on this album has the letters HFB in it. The album's second half was markedly stronger than the first, but I am kind of left ambivalent on this as a whole than I wanted to be. Even those best moments I wouldn't say I loved. It's all just pretty decent, and not much else. I mean, it had the potential to be a lot worse and more embarrassing than it turned out to be. It's certainly nothing outright objectionable, but I doubt I'm coming back to this. I'm probably feeling like a 6.5 out of 10 on it. Alright, next Orbside project is from 2 years later. In 2012, we got We Are Screen by a Screen. That's Patterson in collaboration with Gowdy and Chester Taylor. And alright, this was an Orbside effort is way more obvious than it was on either Transit Kings or HFB, or even FFWD if I'm being honest. It's an ambient dub project for the most part. A bit cleaner and spacier sounding than the Orbserver and the Star House from the same year. But combined with a slight hint of hip-hop. Nearly every track features Chester Taylor's low energy, kinda not really rapping, and occasional kinda not really singing. Now, while this is nowhere near as jarring or off-putting to hear as the HFB album, like, this blend of ambient dub is a lot more in the usual Orb wheelhouses. I don't think that actually translates into a better album. Like, a lot of these instrumentals lean on the kind of sludgy and unpleasant side, but Taylor's vocals make them sound a heck of a lot less pleasant than they already would have otherwise. Like, the guy kind of sounds like if Mike Doty from Soul Coughing was really bored and done with life, and his croaky delivery makes every single track he appears on less fun. And that becomes way more of an active distraction when he attempts to cover Louis Armstrong's What a Wonderful World like an octave lower than everyone else who's tried it. When that happened, I legit burst out laughing because, oh god, that did not remotely work at all. What the fuck were they thinking? Patterson putting on a fake southern US accent on the track Can You Hear Me was a more enjoyable vocal presence than Taylor was. But okay, while I'm not huge on the vocals on this album, there are some good moments here and there. When Taylor covers his voice in vocoder on 15 minutes, it ends up sounding a lot better. The chord progression and synth arpeggios on that one sound oddly familiar, as if I've heard them on some other song, but I can't be bothered to figure out where exactly. Track's still pretty solid and atmospheric. It's nice for what it is. There are two pretty nice instrumental cuts near the end I quite enjoyed as well. Smoke Screen had one of the best dub grooves in the bunch, and Gone Fishing was a straight spacey ambient cut that helped break up the sound of the project quite well. And even if So Lazy is a punchline waiting to happen, I did quite like the chopped up piano samples going into a more standard hip-hop beat, and that track turned out to be pretty alright. But that's pretty much all I got. The album isn't terrible or anything. I still had more fun going through this than I did with the Orbsessions comps. But yeah, more than anything, it's just kind of there. It became background music. Observer in the Star House may not be one of my favorite Orb albums, and I do think this album might be slightly better from an instrumental standpoint in its best moments, but Lee Scratch Perry is still a much more enjoyable vocalist than Chester Taylor, and his presence alone made that album feel much looser and more natural than this one, which just kind of felt like a stocky and stiff one-off curiosity. It's an okay album, but it's probably nothing you need to go out of your way for. Feeling a solid 6 out of 10 on this. Next Orb side project to note is in 2019, and that's A Pail of Air by Chocolate Hills, a collaboration between Alex Patterson and Paul Conboy. I don't know if they've worked together elsewhere, but yeah. I remember a few people asking me about this around the time it came out. I'd seen announcements for it, but didn't even register what it was, and I skipped over it at the time since I saw a lot of the people who did really get into it talked about how it was so much better than that embarrassment, No Sounds Are Out of Bounds. And, okay, if this is only resonating with people who didn't like one of my favorite recent Orb albums, I wasn't sure if that was a good sign. Well, anyway, this one's here for those of you who are waiting for more of the ambient-leaning side of their sound. It's not too far away from COW/Chillout World, but even lighter and more texturally formless. It's nothing especially to write home about, but it is nice for what it is. I barely have anything to say about it at all. You're mostly just getting loads of minimal synth progressions adding up to a single monolithic mass, but it's all very pleasant. There are highlights and lowlights. I quite enjoyed all the different shifting sections of Reclaim, including that one part that sounds like some kind of like liquid ambient techno, and another part that sounds like vibraphone-driven elevator music. But I also like the lonely pianos on Relax, the various synth progressions of Relight. That's another big favorite. I thought Rony FM's ranting on Reboot about, oh, you want augmented reality? You can't handle augmented reality. That was mildly amusing too. I don't really care for Reset. Thought the synth textures got a bit rougher and less pleasant on that one. And the opener Re-Hip went in one ear and out the other. But the album ends quite climactically with the well-textured 22-minute spacey journey of And at the Same Time. Has a slightly more epic and large-scale feel to it compared to the rest of the album, and it brings back the pianos to very nice effect. Probably the best track here by default, though maybe not by that much, since there were a couple of samples in there that I found slightly grating, especially a few chipmunked ones near the end. I don't think this album is essential listening by any stretch. It's a fairly average ambient synth album, and I don't think it's more engaging than Chillout World, which has been growing on me recently, but it's certainly all serviceable for what it is, and honestly I thought it worked well enough to still give a solid 7 out of 10. It's good. And now we're catching up to present day. Next Orb side project of note is The Heavens by Sedibus, a collab between Patterson and Andy Falconer from last year, which I actually have already covered in a Some Stuff I Miss segment, but I wanted to go over again here real quick for the sake of ease of access. Also, since my opinions on this album have marginally shifted since I wrote that segment as well. Of the 4 lengthy pieces here, the 18-minute Unknowable still stands as easily the best part, starting out with a slow build-up into some of the most beautiful, spacious ambience I've heard out of any Orb project in ages, with its dramatic pianos and thick clouds of Blade Runner synth pads, and the way it slowly transitions into more beat-focused sections, which are somewhere between disco-flavored and a slight hint of reggaeton, still retaining the dramatic drive it started with, and damn, I forgot about those tiny little guitar solos too. It's also freaking good. The album's worth it for this track alone. The rest of the album is pretty good. Afterlife Aftershave was admittedly a bit of a letdown coming back to it, especially listening to it right after the Chocolate Hills album, which ended in an even more spacious sounding ambient cut, but it is still decently well textured. It would have been one of the better cuts on that album. Toy 1338B, meanwhile, did markedly grow on me on return visit. It's various progressions through a bunch of different ambient and down-tempo sections, some of which have beats and some of which don't. It came together more cohesively than I remembered, and the repetitive samples saying things like Sputnik and computers make for decent short-term hooks. The track does carry a mystical and uplifting feel to it that I think is quite nice. And then Papillons is still a pretty underwhelming finish to this thing that isn't as interesting or immersive as any of the previous tracks, though that was also a little better than I remembered as well. Certainly has lots of really nice bass rumbling and cool repeating synth washes throughout. It's not a terrible finish by any stretch, it's just not as good as the other ones. I still can't say I think this album is essential listening as a complete whole. I think it's kind of unbalanced pacing-wise and can occasionally be a bit of a mixed bag. Not to mention, you're really not going to find much here that you wouldn't already get on other regular Orb albums. But it is still quite an enjoyable listen with great individual moments. And you know what? I think it's just grown on me enough to upgrade to a 7.3 instead of a solid 7. It's getting a little better. And finally, the last Orb side project to go over just from this past November, Enter the Kettle, Classified as a Weapon by OSS, a collab between Patterson and Philagondiak. I had known about this project as it was rolling out with several singles that I didn't hear and a few delays as well. I could have put it into some stuff I missed, but I'd already started this series by that point and I knew I'd be getting to it for this video, so I saved my thoughts for here. I was marginally excited for this one given the goofier than usual song titles and album title that didn't really have any idea of what to expect. As it turns out, this album is a decent slice of techno that didn't really leave that strong an impression on me. I mean, it's got its moments here and there. Album started pretty strong with Whippersnapper and No Speed Limit, two big steamy mechanical techno bangers that go pretty hard. I quite like the crisper beatwork of Disco Bombing, and Delta River had a nice, more laid-back melodic feel that helped set it apart from the crowd. And there were also a few clunkers here. The album kind of started to feel like it was sliding off for me when we got to Digital Bicycle Clips, which, despite a strong groove, had a few squeaky leads that could get slightly grating. Bad Bochum was just tedious to get through and ended up making the mechanical feel of the album wear out on me. Wow Picasso really threw me off thanks to yet another liberal sample from an outdated meme. It's that freaking wow clip that was big in like the MLG era around 2015. All over this track. To be fair, I don't know if the track was really that great to begin with. It's just kind of another alright techno cut, but giving me flashbacks to Wolfbane was not doing it any favors. The other letdown for me in this album was the closer, which had the fairly promising title Strongman's Variations of a Camel Party, which, as it turns out, is basically just an ambient version of Donuts Forever from No Sounds Are Out of Bounds. Exact same pianos from that track, but more isolated with a slightly different set of samples accompanying it. I mean, I do really like Donuts Forever. This is a pretty decent alternate version of it that makes for a tonally fitting enough closer, but you didn't have to lead me on into thinking it was going to be something completely unrelated. That was kind of lame. So I guess that leaves Enter the Kettle as a whole in the category of mixed bag. Some cuts that work for me, some that don't. Was hoping for it to be more interesting than it was, but I guess it's at least not the worst of the Orb side projects I've talked about. I guess I'll let it off with a 6.7 out of 10. Now, to close this odds and ends off, since I'd rather not end things on such an ambivalent note, I'll quickly talk about a couple of their live albums. The Orb's live concerts were a pretty big part of their appeal too, or so I'm told. I've seen them live once for the No Sounds Are Out of Bounds tour, and they weren't as impressive as I thought they'd be. Though it was a fun time, so whatever. And granted, I assume seeing them in 2018 was a pretty different experience from seeing them in 1993 at their commercial heights. Like, Live 93 is the album that most people will point you towards when people talk about their live albums. They have a few others, but this is the most famous, most widely covered, and easiest to get your hands on. It's a combination of the best material from their first 3 studio albums, including Valley and Plateau, which we hadn't yet seen a proper release at that point. And I can in fact confirm that Live 93 is a pretty epic experience, as you'd hope. There are a few moments that underwhelm somewhat, Little Fluffy Clouds being the most egregious example, with a 10-minute version that doesn't really feel like the song really starts until like 5 minutes in. Though other tracks, especially Plateau and OOBE, are totally transformed in this setting in the best way. I wouldn't say this is on the level of like Orbital's Live at Glastonbury compilation. One can be left wishing this stuff had a bit more energy to it occasionally, but it is quite a bit of fun, as you'd hope. But as much as I like Live 93, that is not my favorite compilation of live recordings that the Orb have ever put out. No, there is one that I believe to be significantly stronger, and that's their compilation of BBC sessions from 1989 to 2001. There are a few downsides to this comp. For one thing, it's no longer widely available on all digital platforms. It used to be, but it's been taken down. Not sure if that's thrash related or sample clearance related or something else. I don't know. But that's unfortunately going to take some more effort to hunt down compared to Live 93, which is right there on all the usual streaming services. The other downside is that this comp doesn't have any crowd noise. It was obviously all live sets broadcasted over the radio and not to a full crowd. But that's not much of an issue, and pretty much all the best live versions of Orb tracks I've ever heard all reside here. I think I've mentioned the 20-minute version of Huge Ever-Growing Pulsating Brain from the 1989 John Peel session before, but to reiterate, it is the best version of Huge Ever-Growing Pulsating Brain that I know of. It's a lot more amped up, stronger dance beats, even more epic and sprawling, more samples including some from Pink Floyd and 808 State, and loads more. Honestly did a better job of keeping my attention through over 20 minutes than the album version did over 18 minutes. And that's how the comp starts, and it's not even the best part. No, the best part of this comp is how it ends. The entire Lamac set right at the end. The last 5 tracks, which include Perpetual Dawn, Ignable, Assassin, Toxigene, and Little Fluffy Clouds. Every single one of these tracks is amped up from their original studio versions. Perpetual Dawn got some female rapper on top who I don't know, but sounds great and fits surprisingly well. Ignable works better as a transition than you would expect. Assassin goes more off the chain than any other version of Assassin that I've ever heard. Toxigene has this random section in the middle where they pretend to stop the set completely thanks to technical difficulties and just switching over to elevator music before fading into the core groove and then finally blasting off again is like one of the coolest moments I've ever heard in a live set. And then finally ending with this version of Little Fluffy Clouds. It can legit get me to tear up. I think it might even be better than the album version. And not even to get into other cool moments of this comp where they cover tracks from the Cydonia era. There's one set where they do some deep cuts like EDM. They do a weird, more experimental version of Once More. They even do I Am the Red Worm. Didn't expect to see that deep cut again, did you? You get other old staples like Montagne d'Or, Oxbow Lakes, Towers of Dub, Backside of the Moon, Into the Fourth Dimension, and more. All fantastic, flowing great together, usually providing a different enough experience from the studio versions to be worth the experience in their own right. And there's also the time where the Orb briefly turned into a punk band and cover No Fun by Iggy Pop and the Stooges, featuring Simon Phillips on the bass, Nick Burton on drums, Thrash on guitar, and lead vocals from Dr. Alex himself. And weirdly, it ends up working pretty credibly. Patterson did start out as a roadie for Killing Joke, so this isn't that completely out of left field. Just kind of out of left field. I'm not going to give out scores for either this or Live 93 for obvious reasons, but both are absolutely worth experiencing and have some of the most special memories I have with the Orb, especially the BBC Sessions comp, which is one of my favorite live albums I've ever heard. It may not be so easy to track down anymore, but it will be worth the effort. And that is going to be where I leave this odds and ends off. The Orb series isn't quite over yet. I will also be doing a top 10 tracks video and or worst to best ranking after this, but in terms of other releases outside of their core studio albums, that's all I have the patience to cover. Sorry this took so long as usual, but whatever. Hope you enjoyed this lengthy breakdown. Of course, all of this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.